I sold the home I cherished my entire life, only to receive a text, "You're not invited. My wife doesn't want you there." I didn't get angry, I just went cold enough to freeze my soul. What they didn't know is that moment sparked a plan. No blood, no violence, just silence sharp enough to bring them to their knees. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now to catch every chilling episode we bring to life. The late afternoon sun slipped through the sheer curtains of a modest but graceful house, nestled on a quiet tree-lined street in San Vinton. The walls tinged with time and trimmed with mahogany molding hummed with silence, a silence not of absence, but of endurance. At the piano sat Grace Nguyen, 74, her slender fingers resting gently on the keys. She didn't play. She simply sat there poised, as if waiting for a cue that never came. The light grazed the silver threads in her hair pulled neatly into a bun, and the soft lilac of her silk blouse made her look like she had just stepped out of another era. And in many ways she had. For 40 years, Grace had taught music discipline by note, kindness by rhythm, generations of children entering her parlor with sticky fingers and leaving with poised hands and proud parents. The piano, an aging upright with faded ivory keys, had been her one true companion since her husband passed 5 years earlier. And today, like so many days since, it was the only thing that still listened. But the quiet didn't last. At precisely 4:07 p.m. there was a knock at the door. She opened it to see her only son Michael and his wife Tracy, both neatly dressed in business casual polish. Michael smiled hesitantly and handed her a bouquet of tulips still in plastic. "Hi, Mom," he said, stepping inside without waiting for invitation. Tracy's heels clicked sharply against the wooden floor. "We didn't want to just call. We figured it'd be better in person." Grace offered a gentle nod and guided them to the living room. The old armchairs, still covered in fabric she had chosen decades ago, felt suddenly too large for the moment. She poured them tea jasmine the way Michael liked it when he was a boy. He didn't notice. "There's something we wanted to talk to you about," he began. Grace tilted her head. "Is everything okay?" Michael exchanged a glance with Tracy, who straightened her back and took the lead. "It's about this house," Tracy said crisply. "It's beautiful, of course, but it's a lot for one person to manage. The space, the upkeep. You deserve somewhere easier, safer." Grace blinked. "This is my home," Michael cut in softer. "We know, Mom, but we were thinking if you sold this place, it could really help us expand heritage. You know the restaurant chain. We found a spot right along the Riverwalk prime location, but we're just short on capital." Tracy leaned forward, her voice smooth like a prepared pitch. "We're not just asking you to give it away. You'd be part of it. A legacy partner. We even thought of naming one of the private dining rooms after you, Madam Grace Room. You could come any time, sit in on meetings, teach music to the kids on weekends." Grace let their words settle into the carpet. She stared at the teacup in her hands, then looked around the room at the faded photos, her wedding portrait with her late husband Henry Michael's 5th birthday party, a teenage recital of his beaming with pride. The house wasn't just wood and stone. It was breath, memory. It was the last place where her husband had laughed out loud, the last place where music still felt like magic. Tracy was still talking. "And you wouldn't be alone. We're thinking maybe we move you to a condo nearby, something manageable. There's one right above a grocery store and it has a doorman. Safe, quiet, close to us." Michael added the grandkids could visit all the time. Grace's eyes stayed on the piano. It hadn't been tuned in 6 months, and yet it still carried more harmony than this room full of polite deceit. She heard her husband's voice echo faintly in her memory. "Grace, don't ever forget that being kind doesn't mean being blind." "I'll consider it," she said finally. Michael sighed in relief. "That's all we're asking." Tracy stood already reaching into her designer purse. "We've had the paperwork drafted just so you can review it. No pressure, of course." That evening, Grace sat in her kitchen alone, the folder untouched on the table, the tulips wilting in their wrapper. She made herself tea. No sugar, just heat and bitterness. She carried the cup to the piano, sat down, and played a piece she hadn't played in years, something Henry had once composed in the early days of their marriage. It was hesitant at first, the notes uncertain, like her hands didn't quite trust her memory, but soon the melody returned, soft, melancholic, strong. A few days later, Michael returned with a notary and a fresh stack of papers. Grace wore her best blouse, the one with pearl buttons, and sat at the same table where she'd once graded hundreds of theory exams. The notary explained the terms. Tracy hovered behind him like a shadow. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "It's going to be good, Mom. You're helping the family move forward." Grace looked at the signature line. Her name stared back at her, Grace N. Gwen bold exposed, waiting to be surrendered. She signed. With one stroke of ink, her home became history. Her silence again was mistaken for consent, her dignity mistaken for docility. Tracy clapped her hands gently. "Thank you so much, Grace. You won't regret this." They left shortly after, already making calls in the driveway. That night, Grace did not cry. She walked through every room, touched every doorknob, every windowsill, as if trying to memorize their temperature. She packed away the photos, placed her husband's old scarf into a small cedar box, and took down a single page of handwritten sheet music from the wall. She sat at the piano for hours, playing until her fingers ached. No one else heard the music that night. But for Grace and Gwen, it was the beginning of something far louder than grief. It was the quiet overture of a reckoning. The boxes arrived before she did. 12 in total, each one labeled in handwriting too careful to be Tracy's and too forced to be Michael's. Kitchenware, books, keep, piano scores, sentimental. The movers were efficient, quiet, and indifferent. They packed 30 years of living into neat cardboard squares and left them in the corner of a 2-bedroom apartment that had all the charm of a waiting room, the kind of place where time passed but nothing lived. Grace Nguyen stood at the entrance of her new home, or what Michael had called a perfect little place just right for you. It was on the 4th floor of a generic high-rise in downtown San Vinton, tucked above a dry cleaner and across from a 24-hour donut shop. The hallway smelled faintly of chlorine and old carpet. The walls were beige, the air still. It was fine, but it wasn't hers. "Your bedroom's that way," Michael had said, pointing to a narrow door beside the kitchen. But once inside, Grace realized the truth. It wasn't a bedroom at all. It had once been the living room, open-windowed, and now hastily transformed with a screen divider and a twin-sized bed pushed into the corner. A single standing lamp lit the room with a cold, white glow. Her upright piano was wedged against the far wall, looking oversized and out of place like a concert hall pianist playing in a fast food joint. "You won't need much," Tracy had added breezily. "We'll take care of your meals. There's no need for you to cook or clean. Just relax." Relax. That word lingered in the air like a bad note. Grace thanked them with a soft smile and watched as they left. The door clicked shut like a judge's gavel. Silence. She unpacked in stages. A sweater here, a photo frame there, a mug with a chip on the rim that she refused to throw away. She hung one piece of art, a charcoal drawing of a violinist in a rainstorm, above the piano, though the wall anchors were crooked and the frame tilted slightly to the left. It didn't matter. Nothing was straight here. That first night she sat on the edge of the bed staring at the black silhouette of her piano in the dark. It was too quiet. No crickets outside, no sound of the river lapping at the shore like it had at the old house. No wind brushing the jacaranda leaves against the windows, just the dull hum of a nearby vending machine and the occasional cough from the neighbor next door. The next morning she made herself breakfast, if one could call it that. Instant oatmeal and hot water. The stove worked, but she felt no desire to use it. The kitchen was small, its counters cluttered with convenience appliances that Tracy had stocked for her: an egg boiler, a pod coffee maker, a mini rice cooker still in plastic wrap, all gadgets, no warmth. By 9:00 a.m., she had already washed the dishes, dusted the windowsills, organized the bathroom, and rearranged the bookshelf twice. She sat down at the piano out of reflex. Her fingers played slowly, deliberately. But there was no joy in the sound. It echoed hollow in the unfamiliar room. The walls didn't absorb music here, they rejected it. Later that week, Michael visited, alone. "I can't stay long," he said halfway through his second text of the visit. "Work's been, Grace poured him tea. "How are the kids?" "Oh, fine. Busy. Soccer robotics, Tracy slammed at the restaurant. Grace nodded. "Do they miss me?" Michael blinked. "Of course, Mom. They love you." But he didn't elaborate. Didn't say they asked for her. Didn't say they wanted to come over. The tea went cold between them. After he left, Grace sat at the piano again. This time she played a song from long ago, Autumn Leaves. Henry used to hum it off key in the kitchen while scrambling eggs. It had been their morning ritual: music, tea, quiet laughter. Now it echoed against the walls like a memory refusing to fade. Days bled into one another. Her phone remained mostly silent. Occasionally Tracy sent a voice memo. "We'll drop by next weekend if we can," or "Let us know if you need groceries." But they never dropped by, and she never asked for groceries. Once Grace called Rebecca her teenage granddaughter. The girl answered with delight, "Grandma," but Tracy's voice cut in soon after Sweetie homework first. "Say goodbye." Click. She began taking long walks, around the block, through the park, into bookstores where no one recognized her. She carried a canvas bag and pretended she had somewhere to be, somewhere waiting. She didn't. Neighbors passed her in the hallway with nods or silence. No one knew who she was. To them, she was just another elderly woman in a building full of them. Her room became a sanctuary and a cage. Every item she touched reminded her of the house she'd lost. The heavy ceramic bowl where she used to mix dough on Sundays. The photo of Michael as a boy barefoot in a puddle. The sheet music she had annotated with notes in red pen, the ones her students had once memorized. Now the only student left was silence. One afternoon she overheard Tracy on the phone in the corridor outside. "No, she's fine. Just lonely, I guess. I mean, what do you expect at that age?" Grace stood behind the door, unmoving. The words struck not like arrows, but like dust, irritating, invasive, impossible to brush away. That night she dreamt of her old house. The porch swing creaked gently. The curtains moved as if dancing. Henry stood at the piano, fumbling through a two-fingered melody and grinning at her. Off-key again, she teased in the dream. When she woke, the room was gray, cold, still. Another week passed. One evening, she joined a community center class, gentle yoga for seniors. But it felt performative, the instructor speaking in scripted warmth, the other participants talking more about medications than memories. She didn't go back. Instead, she began to write. At first, it was just a few sentences in the margins of her music books. But then she filled pages. Letters she'd never send. Thoughts she couldn't say aloud. Regrets, moments, questions. They poured from her like a second symphony, one of ink and ache. She reread Henry's old letters, the ones tied with a blue ribbon and tucked inside her jewelry box. In one dated March 12, 1986, he'd written, "If ever you find yourself alone, know this, you are not unloved. You are the music the world doesn't deserve but desperately needs." She cried quietly that night, not for herself, but for the girl she had been and the woman she had become, giving, yielding, hoping. She counted the days since the move. 26. Not once had Tracy sat with her to ask how she was adjusting. Not once had Michael brought the kids to see her or even remembered her favorite tea. And in those 26 days, she had made more meals for herself than they had in the past 3 years combined. Grace stopped playing the piano altogether. The keys felt foreign. The bench too narrow, the music didn't flow, it scraped. The apartment didn't smell like home. It smelled like plastic and air freshener. She began watching people from the window, young couples holding hands, delivery men rushing between shifts, a woman with a baby in a sling cooing in French. One day she saw a group of music students in uniform walking past. One girl had a violin case slung over her back. She stopped mid-step and closed her eyes. That evening she sat at the piano once more. This time she played nothing from memory. No practiced sonata. No husband's lullaby, just raw, improvised notes, hesitant, broken searching, a conversation without words. When it ended, she sat in stillness. She realized something then. Loneliness wasn't just the absence of people. It was the presence of being forgotten. It was the absence of asking, the silence of regard. Michael hadn't asked about her favorite songs. Tracy hadn't asked what made her mornings feel less empty. No one asked what Grace Nguyen missed or needed or loved. And for the first time since the move, Grace didn't feel small. She felt invisible. But invisibility, she thought, has power, because no one sees what's behind the curtain until you choose to open it. That night, she pulled out her ledger, the one where she recorded all the finances she had poured into Michael's life. The loans, the gifts, the restaurant investment, the education fund, the emergency health coverage, the bridge loan for their first mortgage. She made a list, a ledger not of numbers but of sacrifices. One by one she documented each act of love they had mistaken for obligation, and with every entry the ache inside her quieted. Because she wasn't done. Not yet. Not even close. It began with a misstep, not hers, Michael's. On a Thursday night in late March, the air hung with a damp, uneasy stillness. Rain tapped softly against the narrow windows of Grace Nguyen's apartment, the rhythmic drizzle mingling with the quiet hiss of her kettle on the stove. She had just finished practicing a few lines of Schumann, nothing demanding, just enough to keep her fingers warm, and was preparing her nightly tea, a ritual that had come to feel more like a lifeline than a comfort. Michael had stopped by earlier in one of his increasingly rare visits. He'd come late, stayed briefly, talked mostly about business, and left his phone behind. It was sitting now on her coffee table, buzzing silently with notifications he hadn't silenced. Grace noticed it only when the screen lit up again and again, throwing slivers of white light against the walls. At first she ignored it. It wasn't her place, and yet there it was. His name on the screen, followed by a series of previewed messages from Tracy. Words clipped short by the character limit but revealing more than they should have. She reached for it. She told herself it was practical, he might need it, might come back for it. But the truth was closer to something she hadn't admitted aloud in years. She wanted to feel necessary again. Relevant. Seen. She opened the message thread. What she read hollowed her. Tracy. I don't know how long we're supposed to keep pretending. I'm exhausted. Michael, she's old, babe. She won't be around forever. Tracy. That guest room we promised her is now my storage closet. I swear she still thinks we're going to build a music wing named after her. Michael. She's just naive. Always was. I mean, come on. She gave up that riverfront house without even asking for papers to be notarized on her end. Tracy. She's a burden. And she doesn't even realize it. Grace stared at the screen. The room vanished. The kettle hissed and clicked off. The lights hummed above her, but she heard nothing. Felt nothing. Only the shape of her name sliced between lines of laughter, disbelief, and calculation. A burden. Naive. Old. The phone slipped from her hand and fell to the rug with a dull thud. She didn't pick it up. Her hands, normally so steady, even when guiding a child through Beethoven, now trembled without rhythm or music. Her face, so often serene, collapsed like the inside of a ruined bell. She didn't cry. Not that night. Instead, she stood slowly, as if her bones had aged 10 years in one breath, and walked to her piano. But she didn't sit. She simply placed her palm gently atop the closed lid, tracing the grain of the wood with her fingertips. This was the piano Henry had helped her buy in 1969. They had argued about the price, laughed over its scratch on the left panel, and eventually hauled it into their first home with nothing but a borrowed pickup truck and 2 aching backs. It had survived 4 moves, 2 floods, and a fire alarm that once refused to stop during a recital. That piano had been her voice when she had none, her companion when no one listened. And now it stood silently in a space she didn't choose, watching her heart fracture in the softest way possible by erasure. She moved to her desk next, opened the drawer where she kept the photo albums. She pulled out 3, 1 blue, 1 floral ones, stitched with gold thread along the binding. They were heavier than she remembered. Dust had gathered between the pages like unwelcome commentary. She placed them carefully on the floor, knelt, and opened the first. There they were, moments, the kind that used to anchor her when life got unpredictable. Michael at 2, covered in birthday cake and drool, laughing at something Henry had done off camera. Michael at 10, standing in front of his school project, a model of the solar system made from styrofoam and fishing wire. Tracy and Michael at their wedding, looking youthful and hopeful and unaware. The photo where Grace stood between them, beaming, proud, hopeful. Each photo bled into the next like a silent betrayal. She sat there for hours, flipping through the years, watching her own face change with time, slightly fuller in the cheeks, then thinner, a little more lined, a little more tired. Always smiling, always standing slightly behind the people she loved, always in the background. At some point in the night, the rain stopped. But Grace didn't move. She didn't sleep. She simply let the hours press against her, wave after quiet wave, like the tide in reverse, pulling everything away from her instead of bringing anything in. She imagined what Henry would have said if he were still here. He wouldn't have said much. He would have made her tea, taken her hand, and said simply, "I see you." And in that phrase, everything would be made whole. But he wasn't here. She was alone in a room that wasn't hers, grieving a wound that had no name. The apartment remained dark except for the dim glow of a street lamp casting pale light through the blinds. It drew harsh lines across her face, carving shadows beneath her cheekbones, hollowing her expression. By dawn, Grace had stopped flipping pages. She sat still, her hands in her lap, the albums beside her like open doors she no longer wanted to walk through. Then she stood. She moved methodically like a dancer executing a final sequence and returned each photo to its place. But this time, instead of resting them on the shelf, she wrapped them in cloth and slid them into the bottom drawer of her dresser. Out of sight, not out of mind, but out of reach. She moved through the apartment like a ghost, brushing her hand along the bookshelf, turning the mugs to face backward, smoothing the creases in the bed. She folded the shawl she always kept on the back of the chair and placed it in her suitcase. Something in her had shifted, the kind of shift that couldn't be seen from the outside, but if you looked long enough into her eyes, you'd see it, a stillness not of peace but of resolve. When the sun finally pushed its way through the clouds and warmed the window pane, Grace sat at the piano. She opened the lid, let her fingers hover above the keys. Then she closed it again. Not today, maybe not ever. There was no music in betrayal. There was only silence. And now finally she understood how to listen to it. The silence of betrayal has a peculiar weight different from grief, more corrosive than disappointment. It settles in the bones like frost, quiet, but undeniable. For days after Grace Nguyen read those messages on Michael's phone, she moved through her apartment like a figure behind glass, visible, intact, but untouchable. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. Instead, she waited. She listened to the quiet. And somewhere inside that silence, something ancient and buried began to stir. Resolve. It came not as a spark, but a slow, deliberate flame. On the fourth morning, just after breakfast, she pulled out her old address book. Not her phone, not her email, no digital trace. The leather-bound Rolodex still smelled faintly of lemon oil and ink. Her hands moved with practiced familiarity until she landed on a name she hadn't called in years. Thomas Whitaker, a former law student of her late husband Henry. Once a jittery young man who used to show up to their house with tie askew and shoes dusty from running between lectures. Grace remembered tutoring him on the piano once when he was going through a rough breakup. He'd played Moon River so earnestly she'd nearly wept. Now he was a partner at one of the most respected legal firms in San Vinton. She dialed the number. A pause. Then a familiar weathered voice answered. "Tom Whitaker." "Tom," she said calmly. "It's Grace Nguyen." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "My God," he finally breathed. "Grace, it's been, 10 years? More like 15, she replied. "Is everything all right?" There it was, the polite reflex. "Is everything all right?" Grace took a breath. "No, Tom, it's not. I need your help." The next day, they met at a quiet tea house in the old district, a place untouched by time. The waitress still wore traditional cotton au dye, and the jasmine tea came in delicate porcelain cups that trembled slightly when set down. Tom had aged gracefully. His hair was salt and pepper, his suit a little wrinkled, but his eyes were alert, compassionate. After small talk faded, Grace opened her purse and slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were property sale records, bank transfers, documentation of the financial support she had given Michael and Tracy over the past 5 years, restaurant investments, renovation costs, tuition bills, gifts that were never acknowledged, never repaid, never even appreciated. Tom flipped through it slowly. His expression changed from curiosity to concern, then hardened into something else, something protective. "They used you," he said quietly, repeatedly, systematically. Grace nodded. "I let them." He met her eyes, and now she held his gaze. "Now I'd like to buy it back." Tom blinked. "Excuse me?" "I want to buy a controlling share in their restaurant group, quietly, through a third-party holding company. I want my name nowhere near it, not until I decide otherwise." Tom sat back impressed. "That's bold." "It's overdue," she said. He nodded slowly. "We can set up a shell company. I'll draft the paperwork." "But Grace, may I ask why?" She sipped her tea. "Because they think I'm naive. Because they laughed behind my back. Because they took everything I gave them and called it a burden. But most of all, Tom, because they need to learn that consequences don't only come from strangers." Tom didn't ask any more questions. He simply reached for his pen and his planner. "We'll call it Lilygate Holdings. You'll need startup capital." "I'll get it," she said without hesitation. Back at her apartment, Grace stared at the one item she'd never planned to part with, the Steinway Model Z. It had been a gift from Henry on their 20th anniversary. Not just a piano, a museum piece. Mahogany wood, custom inlays. Its tone, rich and mellow, had carried the sound of her entire life. It was also worth enough to buy her a controlling stake in Heritage Restaurants. That evening she polished it one last time, every key, every edge. Her hands shook not with doubt but reverence. The next morning a private collector from Portland flew in. He was kind, respectful. He'd heard of her old performances, her legacy as an instructor. "I'll keep it played," he promised, sensing the heartbreak in her silence. "I swear it won't gather dust." She nodded, then handed over the keys. Later that night, alone in the apartment, Grace stood in the space where the piano had always lived. The corner now looked naked, vulnerable. But she didn't cry. She opened her drawer and pulled out a slim envelope Tom had given her earlier that day. Contracts, authorization forms, account numbers. She read each word carefully. This time she would not sign without understanding. Then she took a deep breath, pulled out her pen, and with a steady hand signed her name, Grace N. Nguyen, controlling investor, Lilygate Holdings. As her pen lifted from the paper, a shift passed through her, not unlike the final chord of a symphony that leaves the audience breathless. It was not revenge she felt. It was ownership. Ownership of her pain, of her choices, of her voice. For the first time in years, Grace Nguyen belonged to herself again. And it showed. In the steel of her eyes, in the stillness of her hand, in the faint smile that broke across her lips as she folded the papers and placed them in a folder marked simply, "For later." The first irregularity appeared as a single transaction. Tom Whitaker noticed it one evening while reviewing financial reports from the restaurant group. As Grace's legal representative and silent proxy, he had secured access to shareholder records and quarterly disclosures for Heritage, a sprawling chain now boasting 3 locations, 2 food trucks, and a dozen catering contracts across San Vinton. He hadn't expected much at first. A tidy operation he assumed run by the kind of entrepreneurial couple who posted sleek holiday photos from Bali while making just enough to stay afloat. But the moment he cross-referenced the internal expense ledger against the supplier payments, something flickered. A $12,450 invoice from G&T Imports for premium seafood shipment appeared 3 times in the same month. Tom circled the entry, then he kept going. Over the next few days, he combed through 6 months of records, peeling back each transaction like layers of old wallpaper. He didn't tell Grace yet. Not until he was sure. Not until the story had a spine. By the end of the week, he had uncovered over $180,000 in questionable expenditures. Payments to entities with vague names, vendor redundancies, equipment rentals billed twice under different contractor names, and all of them without exception approved by the same internal party, Tracy Nguyen. Her name was on every authorization slip, every expense report. Not Michael's, not the CFO's, just hers. Each entry rubber-stamped with a neat electronic signature and the same 4-word justification: strategic operations, urgent. Tom sat back in his chair, whistling softly. She was clever, he had to admit. Not sloppy, not reckless, but greedy. And worse, confident that no one would look twice. But someone had, and someone was watching now. Grace met with him 3 days later in his office, a book-filled room that smelled faintly of leather and cedar. She wore a dark maroon scarf, and her posture was even straighter than usual. "I know that look," she said as soon as she sat down. "You've found something." Tom handed her a printed packet. More than something. Grace read in silence. The deeper she went, the quieter the room became. At last she looked up. She was stealing. Tom nodded. Embezzling, if we're being legal about it. But cleverly. Always through shadow vendors. Always with a buffer. Enough to confuse, but not enough to alert. Michael didn't notice. If he did, he's complicit. But judging by the structure, I think he's just absent. Tracy's running this show. Grace tapped the paper. "What happens if we expose this?" Tom hesitated. "You want to go public?" "No," she said firmly, "not yet." He tilted his head. She leaned forward, voice low and deliberate. "I want to own it first." And so began the acquisition. Tom, using the framework of Lilygate Holdings, began making targeted purchases of Heritage shares. A few percentage points here, a quiet block there. Most came from minor investors, early supporters ready to cash out after years of modest returns. They had no idea the buyer was Grace Nguyen. No idea the funds traced back to the very woman who'd been excised from her family's circle like a forgotten accessory. Within 6 weeks, Lilygate controlled 17%, then 26%, then almost overnight 41%. Tom called Grace on a Thursday morning with a tremor of disbelief in his voice. "You're the largest shareholder now," he said. "It's official." Grace didn't smile. "Good. Let's keep going." But in the Heritage offices, not everything was calm. Michael first noticed the dilution during a casual meeting with the finance team. "I thought we had 48% locked between us," he said, frowning at the shareholder breakdown. "We did." The analyst replied, adjusting his glasses. "But 2 minority investors sold last month. Their shares went to a consolidated fund, Lilygate Holdings." Michael squinted. "Who?" "It's a holding company. New to the table but very aggressive, acquiring fast." He left the meeting with unease crawling up his spine. Later that evening he brought it up at home. "Do you know anything about this Lilygate group?" he asked Tracy over dinner. She barely looked up from her phone. "What about them?" "They're buying everything." Tracy shrugged. "Happens all the time. Investors see potential. We're trending up, but we're losing control." Tracy met his gaze, expression neutral. "Maybe if you actually attended the last 4 stakeholder meetings, you'd know that." Michael bristled. "I've been managing the operations side." "You've been checked out," she said, cutting him off, "and I've been handling it." He didn't respond. She turned back to her phone. But inside, something shifted in Tracy. That night she opened her laptop and dug into the investor registry. Lilygate Holdings had no website, no listed office, just a legal firm and an anonymous executive committee. She called her assistant the next morning. "Find out everything you can about Lilygate, fast." Within 3 days she had a 1-page summary. "Silent fund," the assistant reported. "East Bay registered. Legal rep is Thomas Whitaker." Tracy froze. She remembered Tom. He had been at her wedding. Henry's friend. Grace's old family connection. Her stomach sank. She dismissed the assistant and shut the door to her office. Alone, she pulled up the latest ledger and scanned the distribution chart. The numbers were damning. If Lilygate acquired 1 more 10% block, they'd have veto power. 2 blocks and they could remove her from the board. She swore under her breath. She picked up the phone and dialed Michael. "We have a problem." Back at the apartment, Grace was reading quietly by the window when her phone buzzed. Tom's message was simple. "They know you're coming." She replied with 2 words, "Let them." Meanwhile, chaos brewed inside Heritage HQ. Tracy convened an emergency meeting. The CFO, the legal counsel, 2 trusted franchise managers, all summoned into a room buzzing with confusion. "What exactly are we dealing with?" one of them asked. "A hostile takeover," Tracy snapped, "or a soft one. Either way, we've lost majority leverage." Michael sat with arms crossed, eyes darting nervously. "Can we buy them out?" he asked. "Too expensive," the CFO said. "And they're not selling, they're positioning." positioning for what Michael asked. Tracy didn't answer. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, staring down at the city skyline. The realization was sinking in fast. They weren't just losing control of a company. They were being played by someone who knew them intimately, by someone who had once sat at their table, who had written checks without question, who had been thanked with tight smiles and forgotten birthdays. Grace Nguyen wasn't just buying back shares. She was reclaiming ground, and somewhere deep inside, Tracy felt the very first pang of panic. Not because they might lose revenue, but because they had underestimated the wrong woman, and now it might cost them everything. It arrived on a Monday morning, cream-colored, embossed in gold formal, in the way that said something important, something powerful. The envelope was addressed to Michael Nguyen, CEO of Heritage Restaurants. No return address, only the seal of Lilygate Holdings. He opened it over his second cup of coffee, expecting perhaps another pitch deck, a quarterly recap, or one of those painfully scripted investor newsletters. But this was different. Notice of emergency shareholders meeting. Friday, 8:30 a.m. Agenda: Executive Restructuring Board Composition Allocation of Dividends. Michael stared at the header, his eyes narrowing. No signature, no explanation. Just a date, a time, and a power play written in elegant font. Tracy walked into the kitchen wearing her morning robe and that air of effortless control. "What's that?" He handed her the letter. She read it, eyes moving quickly. When she got to the bottom, her lips pressed into a hard line. "They're forcing a vote," she said. "Who?" "Lilygate." Michael didn't respond. The air between them turned electric. "Find out who's behind this," she snapped. Friday arrived like a storm cloud. The Heritage Corporate Boardroom on the 23rd floor was a space designed to intimidate glass walls, a polished oak table that stretched nearly the length of the room, and panoramic views of downtown San Vinton. The skyline blazed under the morning sun, but inside the atmosphere was tense. Board members trickled in with briefcases and guarded glances. The whispers started early. "Did you hear who called it?" "No one knows." "I heard it's a buyout." "I heard it's a hostile takeover." The legal counsel stood near the door, unreadable. Junior partners fidgeted with their phones. Tracy walked in first, tailored in a navy blazer that meant business and heels that meant war. Michael followed close behind, face pale but controlled. "Any word from Lilygate?" she asked one of the associates. "They sent their representative. Should be arriving any minute." And then quiet. The doors opened. Every head turned. Grace Nguyen stepped inside. There was a half-second where the entire room froze. The whispers died. Coffee cups halted mid-air. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. She wore a slate gray pantsuit. Her white hair was swept up neatly. No jewelry beyond a modest pearl pin. And in her eyes, clear, calm, focused, was something that no one had seen before. Authority. Tracy stood motionless, her eyes wide. "What is this?" Grace walked towards the far end of the table, the chair reserved for the meeting chairperson, and sat down slowly without asking. "I believe this meeting was called to address urgent matters," she said, her voice cool, unmistakable. Michael's voice cracked. "Mom." She didn't look at him. "Mr. Whitaker, would you please distribute the documentation?" Tom Whitaker, seated at her left, opened a leather portfolio and began handing out copies of a packet labeled Majority Ownership Disclosure, Lilygate Holdings. Tracy snatched a copy and flipped through it. The numbers were undeniable. Lilygate now owned 51.3% of Heritage Restaurants. Grace Nguyen was the sole name beneficiary. Her voice carried evenly across the room. "I am the controlling shareholder of this company, effective last quarter. And as such, I've called this meeting to propose a reallocation of Heritage's forthcoming profit dividends." Murmurs broke out again. Tracy slammed her copy of the document on the table. "This is insane." Grace looked at her calmly. "What's insane is allowing people who think loyalty is a weakness to run a business built on tradition." Michael whispered, barely audible. "You bought us out." "No," she replied. "I bought myself back in." Silence again. Then Grace opened her briefcase and removed a small folder. She slid it to the center of the table. "This," she said, "is a proposal." The board members leaned forward. On the cover, embossed in gold, the Huang Music Foundation. Beneath it, a subtitle, a scholarship initiative dedicated to providing music education and conservatory pathways for underprivileged youth in San Vinton. Grace stood. Her voice, now firmer, resonated through the room. For decades, this family has benefited from generosity that it neither acknowledged nor respected. I have no desire to control this company permanently, but I do wish to leave behind something worthy." She paused. "I am willing to transfer all my voting shares and dividends, every cent, into this foundation, on one condition." Her eyes locked on Tracy's. "That this board unanimously approves the establishment and funding of the Huang Music Foundation, effective immediately, with matched donations from Heritage, with permanent transparency, and with no opposition." Tracy stood, her face taut with fury. "You think you can walk in here after everything and demand we hand over company profits to some vanity project?" Grace didn't blink. "It's not a vanity project, it's a debt." "You're bluffing," Tracy hissed. "If we refuse what you'll sue." "I won't have to," Grace said, "because I'll keep my 51% and open the books." Every board member flinched. Open the books, an audit. And Tracy's name was on every financial discrepancy. Michael stared at this table, saying nothing. "I don't want revenge," Grace continued. "I want restoration. For the girl in District 9 who never got to touch a piano. For the boy whose talent died in silence. For the part of this family that used to believe in more than cash flow." A beat. Then she sat. Tracy said nothing. The general counsel cleared his throat. "Let's proceed to vote." Hands went up one by one. Even Tracy's. Unanimous. The meeting adjourned with hushed voices and stiff handshakes. Board members filed out quietly. A few nodded to Grace as they passed, a flicker of respect in their eyes. Michael lingered behind. "You planned this all along." Grace finally turned to him. "No," she said. "You did. The day you forgot who I was." She left him standing there. In the elevator alone, she stared at her reflection in the mirrored panel. It was the face of a woman who had once given everything and been told it wasn't enough. Now she had taken back something far greater. Not just her dignity, her legacy. It was almost dusk when she arrived. The sun hung low over the San Vinton horizon, bathing the quiet neighborhood in amber light. The air smelled of warm cement and jasmine. Grace was on her front porch, a cup of tea cooling beside her, the faint notes of a Chopin nocturne drifting through the open window. She was halfway through a book she'd read a dozen times before, but this time she didn't get to the next page. A knock, light, hesitant. She looked up, and there, standing just beyond the white gate, was Rebecca. Not the little girl who used to run through her backyard chasing bubbles, not the teenager who rolled her eyes at family dinners, but someone different now, someone older, quieter, shoulders a little stooped from carrying weight no one had noticed. She held her phone in one hand and a small bouquet in the other, lavender and marigold slightly wilted from the walk. Grace didn't speak. She simply stood, stepped down from the porch, and opened the gate. Rebecca smiled nervously. "Hi, Grandma." Grace nodded once. "Hi, sweetheart." They sat together on the porch. For a moment the silence was fragile like thin glass. Rebecca looked around. The house was modest, but inviting, planters full of herbs, wind chimes swaying lazily, a watering can still beating droplets onto the steps. Grace had made this place her own piece by piece. "I didn't know you moved out here," Rebecca said. "I didn't know you were looking." Rebecca winced a little. I was, just not soon enough." Grace sipped her tea. "You're here now." Rebecca nodded, then looked at her lap. "I saw the article. About the foundation. Dad's not handling it well." Grace didn't flinch. "He'll be fine. He says you blindsided them." "I gave them a chance to do right," Grace replied. "They declined." Rebecca went quiet. A breeze passed between them. "I miss your piano," she said after a moment. "The big one. The one that used to live next to the window. You'd play at night when I couldn't sleep." Grace smiled faintly. "It has a new home now. Someone else is playing it." Rebecca looked up. "You're not mad about all of it?" Grace turned to face her fully. "No, Rebecca. I'm tired, but I'm not mad. And I'm not broken. But what they did..." "I know." Rebecca's throat tightened. "They didn't even tell me you moved. I found out from Aunt Lisa. She thought I already knew." Grace didn't reply. Rebecca wiped her eyes quickly. "I don't even know why I'm crying. Because the body remembers what the heart tries to forget." Rebecca gave a soft laugh that sounded too much like a sob. "You always say things like that." "It's the music teacher in me," Grace said gently. A pause. Then Rebecca said almost too quietly, "Can you teach me?" Grace blinked. "Music." Rebecca nodded. I never learned. Not properly. Dad said it wasn't practical. And Mom, well, you know Mom. I do. Rebecca exhaled. Sometimes I think if I'd had music, I might have felt things better, known what to do with them. Grace reached for her hand. It's never too late. Music doesn't judge your timing. They sat like that, two women, one old, one young, both bridged by silence. Then Grace stood. Come inside. The living room was simple but full of warmth. An upright piano sat against the far wall, not the Steinway, but something sturdy and kind. On top of it sat a metronome, a few loose sheets of music, and a framed photo of Grace and Henry from decades ago, he with his crooked tie, she with her eyes full of mischief. Rebecca hovered by the doorway. Grace lifted the lid of the piano and ran her fingers gently over the keys. This one doesn't have the same voice, she said, but it still speaks. She patted the bench. Rebecca hesitated, then walked over and sat beside her. Grace pulled a blank sheet from the stack. Let's start with middle C. Her fingers pressed the key. Soft, steady. Rebecca watched, then mimicked. A little sharp. Again, Grace said. She did. Better. And again. And then slowly a scale. Then another. Until the notes began to connect like puzzle pieces. Grace didn't speak much, only nodded, corrected her posture, tapped her wrist now and then. Rebecca played for nearly 40 minutes without realizing the time had passed. When she finally looked up, her eyes were glassy. Grace handed her a tissue. You're not crying because you're bad at it. I know, Rebecca whispered. I'm crying because it feels like home. Grace nodded. They sat quietly, the piano still echoing faintly. Why didn't you fight them earlier? Rebecca asked. You could have. Grace took her time before answering. Because I thought love would be enough. That if I gave, they'd see. That if I stayed quiet, they'd hear. And now, I know that love to mean anything can't be silent. And it can't be conditional. Rebecca's lips quivered. Do you still love them? Grace didn't hesitate, always. Rebecca sobbed, once sharp and short, then leaned into her grandmother's shoulder. Grace wrapped an arm around her, steady and sure. After a while, Rebecca sat up and wiped her face. I want to help with the foundation, she said. I don't know anything yet, but I want to learn. I want to teach. Maybe even perform someday. You will. You really think so? Grace smiled. You've already started. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon. Inside, a girl found her song, and a woman-long silence passed it forward. The knock came just after 10 a.m. Grace had been watering her garden parsley, mint, and lemon balm tucked into ceramic pots. The sky above San Vinton was a bright, merciless blue. A day too beautiful for what she already sensed was waiting on the other side of that door. She didn't rush. She finished tying the string around the tomato stalk and placed her gloves neatly on the step. When she opened the door, they were all there. Michael, Tracy, and unexpectedly Toby, her youngest grandson. Toby looked uncomfortable, holding a plastic toy in one hand and a juice box in the other. His face was pale. He didn't say anything. Michael cleared his throat. His voice was rehearsed but uncertain. Hi, Mom. Grace leaned slightly on her cane. You found the address? Tracy stepped forward. We wanted to talk. About what? There was a beat. Then Michael tried again. We're in trouble. Grace waited. Heritage is under review, he continued. One of our suppliers filed a complaint. There's an audit underway. It's bad, and we need help. Grace didn't move. What kind of help? Financial, Tracy said bluntly. We're trying to stabilize things, reorganize. It's short term. No, Grace said. Just that, one word, no explanation. Michael blinked. What? No, Tracy scoffed. You can't be serious. I'm perfectly serious. Michael stepped forward. Mom, we're not asking for a handout. We just need a bridge. Something to hold us until the board settles. You have the capital. I have peace, Grace said. And I won't spend it on people who taught me what betrayal feels like. You're holding a grudge. I'm holding a lesson, she replied. And it's taken me a lifetime to learn it. Tracy's voice sharpened. You think you're better than us now because you threw money into some charity and got your name on a wall? Grace didn't flinch. No, I think I'm finally myself. Because I stopped waiting for people to value me before I valued myself. Michael's tone cracked. We're your family. She looked at Toby, and then back at them. No, she said quietly. You were my family, and then you asked me to vanish. And now you're here because something you built without me is crumbling without me. Tracy's mouth twisted. You're punishing us. Grace tilted her head. I'm refusing to repeat a mistake. Michael lowered his voice, pleading now. "Mom, please, we're trying." "No," Grace said again, her voice unwavering. "You're scrambling. That's not the same thing." Tracy stepped forward, fire in her eyes. "You sanctimonious old—" "Tread carefully," Grace interrupted, calm as ice. "Because I've let you say far too much for far too long. You abandoned your own son. I released a grown man who kept asking me to shrink so he could feel tall." Michael's face crumpled. "That's not fair." Grace's tone softened just slightly. "No, it's true, and you know it." Toby shifted uncomfortably. Grace knelt slowly, her bones creaking with age, and looked him in the eye. "Hi, Toby," she said gently. He looked at her, unsure. "Do you remember when we made cookies? The kind with cinnamon and too much sugar?" He nodded slowly. "Do you remember what you told me?" He shook his head. "You said, 'Grandma, this is what home smells like.'" He blinked and his lip trembled. Grace smiled, then stood again, steadying herself. "I don't hate you," she said to Michael and Tracy, "but I won't fund your redemption. That's yours to earn." Tracy's hands curled into fists. "You're unbelievable." Grace met her gaze. "And you're unready. No one can rescue someone who refuses to grow up." Michael's voice was barely audible. "Is this final?" She nodded. Tracy turned jaw tight, storming off without another word. Michael followed slowly, shoulders sagging, Toby's small hand wrapped in his. They didn't say goodbye. Grace closed the door behind them, not with anger, with peace, and on the table behind her sat an envelope, labeled the Huang Music Foundation, Application Round 1. She picked it up and smiled. The door may have closed, but something far more powerful had opened. The headlines came fast. Heritage restaurants to close 3 locations amid financial turmoil. Executive shakeup, Tracy Nguyen removed as COO after board vote. Legal troubles mount as former execs face financial review. Grace read none of them. She heard bits from Tom, who still followed the industry wires. Occasionally her neighbors would mention seeing her son's name on the evening news, or a friend would forward her a link asking delicately if she was okay. She was. Tracy lost her position first quietly through a vote she never saw coming. The same boardroom where she once reigned fell silent when her name came up on the agenda. No one defended her. No one blocked the motion. By that afternoon, her parking pass had been deactivated. Then came the closures. The Uptown Bistro, with its polished marble counters and imported chandeliers, sold within 2 weeks to a hotel chain. The food truck operation folded overnight. And the flagship restaurant, once hailed in glossy magazines, was placed on the market pending restructuring. Michael didn't fight it. He couldn't. Months of missed investor calls, unresolved invoices, and damaged brand reputation had worn him down. Quietly, he submitted his resignation. Quietly, he moved out of their high-rise condo. And quietly, the creditors came. Toby, still in school, became collateral damage. His tuition bills sat unpaid. His credit cards, those Tracy had co-signed to build responsibility, spiraled. Grace knew all of this and said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't show up at their doors with moral lectures or whispered satisfaction. She simply lived, tended her garden, practiced her scales, drafted scholarship documents, taught 2 students, one from a refugee center, one from a foster program. And each week without fail, Rebecca came. It started as Saturday mornings, then became weekends, then weekdays after work. She brought groceries sometimes just stories. Grace taught her finger placement, then tempo, then phrasing. They began working on a duet, Bach's concerto for 2 keyboards. And in those sessions, those sun-drenched afternoons filled with chords and pauses, something new took root, a quiet, undeniable love. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. They played facing each other, sometimes laughing at mistakes, sometimes just closing their eyes and letting the notes carry them. Rebecca's hands grew more confident. Her posture changed. Her tone deepened. She started arriving early, staying late. Once she said, "I don't know how to say it, but this saved me." Grace looked at her, her voice barely above a whisper. "It saved me too." Outside, the world turned. Inside their small living room, generations stitched themselves together again, not with apologies, but with music. One evening, as the golden hour bathed the house in amber light, Rebecca arrived with her own keyboard second-hand, a little scuffed, but hers. She set it beside the upright and plugged in a small amp. "Let's play outside today," she said. Grace raised an eyebrow. They moved the instruments to the patio. Birds chirped. The breeze rustled the rosemary. And in that backyard under the wide San Vinton sky, the music began. Neighbors stopped on sidewalks. Children listened from fences. Someone down the street turned off their lawnmower. Grace on the piano. Rebecca on her keyboard. Together, filling the air with something weightless yet permanent. A melody that spoke of what was lost and what was finally gratefully found. 6 months later, Tuscany opened its arms like a long-forgotten promise. Grace Nguyen stood on the stone balcony of a centuries-old villa nestled among olive trees and vineyards, sunlight dancing through linen curtains. She had come with Laureen, her old friend, former colleague, and co-conspirator, in reclaiming joy. Italy had been a dream once shelved for duty, for family, for survival. Now, finally, it was hers. They had wandered Rome, marveled at Michelangelo in Florence, tasted wine that lingered like memory in Montepulciano. But it was this final leg, Tuscany quiet and sun-drenched, that made Grace feel like she was floating inside a lullaby written just for her. That morning, while Laureen journaled by the garden, Grace's phone buzzed softly beside her espresso. It was Rebecca. "Grandma, I'm applying. For real this time. Music conservatory. Scholarship. It feels huge, terrifying, beautiful. I'm doing it because you reminded me who I am. Wish me luck. Love you." Grace exhaled slowly, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. No tears, only warmth. She opened her notebook and scribbled at the top of a blank page. Freedom, a composition she had been humming in her heart for weeks. Not sorrow, not revenge, but peace earned, joy reclaimed. A song without apology. That evening at a vineyard with a sunset piano on a terrace overlooking the valley, Grace played it for the first time. Locals paused their meals. Tourists looked up from their wine. Even the birds seemed to hush. Each note carried sunlight and shadow. A life of sacrifice, betrayal, endurance, and now release. Laureen watched from a wicker chair nearby, hands folded, eyes damp. And Grace, she played not as someone recovering from pain, but as a woman who had walked through fire and come out singing. As the final chord faded into the golden horizon, she lifted her eyes bright, unburdened, and wholly alive. She wasn't just remembered. She was radiant. In that moment beneath the Tuscan sky, Grace Nguyen became what she had always quietly been. A song of freedom.